Tom Woods, our speaker tonight, he's a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. And it could be also said that he actually managed to get through the entire pipeline of the Ivy League system and came out clean on the other side. He has been an accomplished writer. He's written 12 books, including Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. He's written Nullification, which is what we are going to be hearing about tonight. He wrote Meltdown, which was written in 2008, right following the breakdown, and identified, I think, better than anybody else, the underlying causes in a succinct way for the average person to see. He's the author of numerous scholarly articles. He's been on numerous television shows. He's been on Judge Napolitano's show. If I'm not mistaken, I think the judge might even be the godfather of one of his children. I'm not sure about that, but I think so.
Interview with the zombies.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to get out of the way here and let Tom come up. But I also want to pass on that he has also started what is called Liberty Classroom, which is an online device where people can actually get on and learn about all the various subjects from professors that he has picked, who I would implicitly trust, not ones that perhaps I got fed when I went to school. So, and also I wanted to pass on to that he has also generated 400 videos for Ron Paul's homeschool program. So I think I'd like to bring up Tom Woods and have him pass on to you about the latest subject, or not the latest subject, but a subject that's ongoing that we need to have reintroduced into Idaho again after he made a first attempt a few years ago. And it's called Nullification, Enforcing the Constitution.
Thank you, Alan, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about myself because it helps to get us to our subject matter tonight. The things I'm going to tell you tonight are things that you wouldn't learn in a typical classroom. And if anyone found out you were learning them tonight, they would be appalled. But that's what I specialize in, and I want to say a little bit about how I came to specialize in forbidden subjects in American history and in other fields. I guess I grew up in a blue-collar household. I had a father who was, I wouldn't say he was a Reagan Democrat. He was a Republican, and he loved Reagan. And he was the guy who really gave me my first political education. He was the guy, even though he didn't get his GED till he was in his 40s. But maybe because he was so self-conscious about not having finished high school in the formal way, he was reading constantly. He knew something about everything. I caught him one day reading Candide by Voltaire, and I said to him, all right, look, Dad, even I don't want to read Voltaire's Candide. I mean, enough's enough. Like, you've proven yourself. I know you know a lot. Now, go enjoy yourself for a while. But he was the one, for example, who taught me what communism was and how terrible it was. And I just had no patience for people who were soft on the commies after my father told me how evil it was. So that was how I got onto, I think, some kind of freedom path. I had a secret weapon. I had my father giving me, a leg up, in effect, so that I wouldn't be snookered by the propaganda. Then I went off to college. Now I came from a conservative, quaint little New England town. Like, we have the town common where we have the annual sheep shearing festival, and we have the little general store that's hundreds of years old, and the little congregational church in the center of town. It is everything you would think of in an old New England town. And every time there was a U.S. Senate election, our town voted against the incumbent every time. Whether we were voting against Ted Kennedy or John Kerry, we voted in vain for whoever the other guy was. It didn't matter if he was in prison, we voted for him. Every single time. That was my town. Then, as for my undergraduate studies, I went to Harvard. So I get thrown into the most radical city, certainly in New England and possibly in the United States, and I was not quite ready for what I encountered there. I remember going to the dining hall where we would eat dinner every night, and waiting outside for us every night in front of that dining hall was a group of people selling, I am not making this up, a communist newspaper. It was called the Workers' Vanguard. And they were saying that this was back in 1990, that the United States was on the verge of the socialist revolution, which it really wasn't, it turned out, but they were convinced that just right around the corner. And I would debate these people like an idiot. You know, like there's zero chance they're going to change their minds. These are people who are saying we need to go back to the principles of the Russian Revolution. The principles of the Russian Revolution, by the way, for those of you who might be too young to have studied the Russian Revolution, is pretty much murder your political enemies, put them in concentration camps, just completely dismantle the freedom of speech, set up a one-party dictatorship, then, well, because of your complete incompetence, starve millions of people to death because of a famine, because you tried to abolish the use of money. You thought you could run a major economy without the use of money. And I mean, it's just, when you think about one thing after the other, and then we're going to liberate you from the tyranny of the czars and their terrible secret police. Well, under the communists, you got a secret police that was 16 times larger. So I used to vainly try to debate these people, and it just didn't work. I made no headway whatsoever. But in doing so, I became interested in history. I showed up at Harvard thinking I would maybe be a math major. Okay. By the way, go around telling people that you're a math major and see how many friends you make. People are making the sign of the cross and, you know, trying to back away. But if you say that you're interested in history, because, oh, I always loved history, or I watched the History Channel. Okay, well, people, but that's what you get. You get that all the time. So when I decided I would switch, because I thought, I don't think I want to devote my life to math. Now, on the other hand, though, I love teaching math to my kids. I love doing math problems. I mean, I know that's a strange thing. It's not quite the strangest thing about me, but I'd say it's in the top 5 anyway. When I was in school, I was the captain of the math team in high school. This was not something I went around telling a lot of people about. But now, nobody cares, right? I mean, you know, nobody's laughing at me now, right? So I went into history instead. Also because I met a lot of the math majors. I can't be one of these people. So, at Harvard, the math majors, all they did was math, and so in their spare time, they read books on number theory. And I thought, well, how can I compete with these people? In my spare time, I'm reading history books. Why don't I just become a historian? So it was debating the commies that got me onto this path. And then there was a course where my professor said, all right, go out and buy the books, and I've ordered them for you at the bookstore. But not the usual Harvard bookstore where you got your books typically. No, this guy went out of his way to be as annoying as possible. He ordered the books from Revolution Books. Well, this was not the Ron Paul Revolution. No. I went down into this basement, dingy store, and they've got a picture of Chairman Mao on the wall. Now, again, for the younger people, this is arguably the greatest mass murderer in the history of the world, who apparently has just been misunderstood by the historians. Because there he is up on the wall, and they've got other communist leaders on the wall. And here's indignant little Tom Woods at age 18, and I decided, doggone it, I am not buying my books from these people. I will go all around this city until I can find a place that's 10% less communist than this one, and I'll buy them there. But that was what really put me face to face with the utter insanity of where I was. In fact, the first article I've written an awful lot, as Alan mentioned. First article I ever wrote was a write-up about my experiences at one of the meetings of these people. I followed them one night. Where do these people go? They had a meeting about, because now this is 1991. The Soviet Union is collapsing, and most communists even were saying, well, that wasn't real communism anyway, you can't blame us for that. That was Stalinism, totally different. We have nothing to do with this. It's not our fault. Not these people. They had a little meeting about how terrible it was that the Soviet Union was falling apart. One of the great totalitarian nightmares people tried to flee from. It's awful that it's falling apart. And they actually passed around a collection plate so we could donate to prevent the Soviet Union from falling apart. Now, apparently, the $37.12 they raised was not sufficient. But from that moment on, I thought, okay, I am in my element. Because I love history, and I love sticking it to the bad guys. And it turns out there are ample opportunities to do this. So what I've done in my professional career is I've written some scholarly books that for university presses and academic presses. But I've also written books for the general public. Because as an academic, I had this crazy idea that I might want to write books that people would read. I wrote all my scholarly articles in the journals. I got my credentials. I did all that. And then I said, that is the last one of those I am ever writing. I never need to do this again, writing for journals that no one in his right mind reads. Instead, I'm going to write books that might have an influence on people. And I'm going to write these books in a way that takes ideas that have been ignored or distorted and explains them correctly. So the first time I did this was in 2004 with a book Alan mentioned. I wrote a book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. Now that book sold a lot of copies, I think on the strength of the title. That is a brilliant title. I didn't come up with it. The publisher came up with it. That title virtually compels you to read it. Like, I've got to know what's in this thing. And what I did in this is I told the history of the U.S. the way I used to teach it to my college kids. And I told it in a way that was Jeffersonian. I told it from the point of view of Thomas Jefferson. I told it from the point of view of a supporter of limited government, of a supporter of the free market economy, which is not the sort of person who writes the typical U.S. history textbook, by the way. Having read many of them in my career, I can attest to this. So I wrote this, and I thought, well, maybe it'll make a little bit of a splash. Well, little did I know, not only did it become a New York Times bestseller for 12 weeks, but the New York Times itself decided, now this book is just over the line. Like, we cannot sit back and allow Americans to read this without commenting on it. Now, they did not review the book in the book review section, as you might expect. No. This book was so dangerous, it had to be attacked in a signed editorial on the editorial page. Americans, don't read this book. Now, what do you think a 16-year-old does when people say, now, don't read this book? This is not just a joke, that was by far the biggest sales week the book ever had. By far. So with all my I had another book on the New York Times bestseller list years later. They ignored it completely. They put it on the list, and it was the only one that did not get reviewed. They're not going to make that mistake again. But at the time, I was still kind of a kid. I was in my 20s, or was I in my 20s? I was in my early 30s, but still kind of kid-ish. I know the younger people are thinking, wow, he was old. I still felt like, in academia, you're a kid. And I really was wondering, is my career over? The New York Times has denounced me. The Boston Globe denounced me. I had a whole list of them. But it turned out that people who weren't going to like me anyway didn't like me. But people who might be inclined to read my book were much more inclined to read it after these attacks. But then and here's really where I'm going with this. What's so interesting to me about the way the New York Times went after that book was that it did not argue that I made errors. It did not say, wow, I can't believe Wood says X. Wood says A, but the truth is B. They did not say that even one time. It was, we can't believe Wood said A. Okay, but what if A is true? Well, we can't believe you said it. Okay, but this is America, that whole thing, right? Saying things is okay. So in my reply, I did write a reply. And I said, but the thing is, I have evidence for every single claim I made. Like, they couldn't believe that I had supported the idea of nullification, which I'm talking about tonight, and said that that's perfectly okay and perfectly constitutional. In no way did they try to refute me. I argued that the Marshall Plan was not responsible for the recovery in Western Europe after World War II. That is easily demonstrable. I had a whole list of these. Now, yes, that's true. This is not what you read in your 8th grade textbook. But, you know, research moves along after that textbook that was written by a committee in 1952. You know, we've studied things a little bit more since then. So what really got to me was that their complaint was that I had said things that fell outside the boundaries of acceptable opinion. And of course, those boundaries are established by the New York Times. They will decide for us what we're allowed to say, and what arguments we're allowed to have, what debates we can have. And I just thought, no, I just forget these boundaries. I want to knock these boundaries down and, you know, set them on fire. And that's pretty much what I've done with all my books since then. So I had a book, as Alan mentioned, in 2010 called Nullification. And it's got President Obama on the cover, and it's got them. He's signing Obamacare, so he's got Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi and just a whole crew of your best friends in the world on that cover. And the word nullification is stamped in rubber stamp style right over their faces, so that even if you have no idea what nullification is, you look at that cover and say, whatever it is, I like it. It's just what I liked about that cover. So I want to talk to you about that tonight. And now you see, this is something that is not at all approved by the New York Times. And yet, I wrote about it anyway. I mean this as a model for all of you. Okay? Don't let these people tell you what you're allowed to talk about. We would never debate anything if the New York Times had its way. The New York Times is perfectly okay if you are debating whether taxes should be 40% or 38.3%. That's a debate they are totally at home with. Go ahead, knock yourselves out, argue about that all day long. But if you want to ask, well, gee, you know, should we have an income tax? Is that a good principle at all? Well, now you are a crazy extremist citizen. We haven't authorized you to have that debate. Who are these creeps? And what's beautiful, by the way, is that we're living at a time in which it is possible that in our lifetimes there could perhaps be no more print edition of the New York Times. I mean, who could have dared to dream such an outcome coming true? You know, and here we are thinking about it. So if you ever get discouraged, just remember, the New York Times is hemorrhaging money, and that'll put a smile back on your face. Nullification is an idea that goes back at least to Thomas Jefferson, but as I'm going to show you tonight, goes back even beyond Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson is a very much admired person, as we all know. So that's why critics of the idea go out of their way to pretend there was no Thomas Jefferson. Because if you get the idea that Thomas Jefferson endorsed this idea, you might take it seriously. And it's a forbidden idea. You're not supposed to take it seriously. The idea basically runs like this. What nullification is trying to confront is the problem that you have a federal government and you have a U.S. Constitution, and the Constitution lays out what the limits of the federal government are. Article 1, Section 8 spells out this is what the Congress can do. And that's it. Now, if this were a different talk, I would prove to you that, in fact, only what is in the Constitution, listed in Article 1, Section 8, is what the federal government can do. Even though there's a general welfare clause and all that. I talk about that in the book Nullification. But I'm going to take for granted that that is established, that the federal government can do only the things listed in Article 1, Section 8. And if it tries to do something that's not in Article 1, Section 8, that's unconstitutional. Because, the way one of my friends puts it, I love this. He says, if you look at the Bill of Rights, we all know that's the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And by the way, I remember being in the classroom, and in all sincerity, a poor kid, when I said, does anybody happen to know one of the first, we're talking about the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. I am not joking. He said, thou shalt not kill. And, you try to make every answer sound like a good answer when you're in education. But that one I just had to pretend I didn't hear, because I didn't know where I was going to go with that. But one of my friends puts it that when you look at the first 10 amendments, it's saying things like the federal government can't restrict the freedom of speech or the freedom of religion or the right to bear arms. You can't do this, can't do this, can't do this, can't do this. And the 10th Amendment basically says, and if we forgot something, you can't do that either. That's basically what it is. So if it does something that's unauthorized, it's violating the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. Okay, Very straightforward. That was exactly how Thomas Jefferson viewed the Constitution, exactly the way I just described it to you. The government can do these things and these things only, and if it goes beyond that, then it's violating the Constitution. Now here's the problem. What if it does go beyond? Or, I mean, this is just a theoretical point right now. Like, what if it should go beyond those powers in Article 1, Section 8? Then what? Does the Constitution grow fangs and go and get them? Well, really, nothing happens. Strictly speaking, nothing happens. You could say, well, the Supreme Court will step in and stop that from happening. But it doesn't really work that way in general. Right? That doesn't really happen. And moreover, the Supreme Court is also part of the federal government. So it may not be an impartial source when deciding what the federal government can do. So nullification was conceived of as a tool to stop it from doing things it's not authorized to do. It's a tool that the states can use because the states are a major part of America. Because what's the country called? It's not the United States of America. It's states in the plural. And in fact, if you go and look at your Constitution, and I'm sure if you are a student in this room, your parents have repeatedly given you pocket copies of the Constitution that you keep losing, and they keep giving you a new one. If you flip through there, you will find that every time the United States is referred to in the Constitution, it is referred to not in the singular, but in the plural. It's referred to as a group of places